Hi, guys. Today we're going to talk about World War II. Um, right up front, though, I want to tell you this is actually going to be two parts. So this is only going to be part one. We'll do part two next week. It's just that it's so long. And I started doing this and writing the lecture and realized that I didn't want to overwhelm you with watching an hour-long video about McNeil talking about World War II. And so we're going to split into two parts. We're going to do the first half of the war, which is pretty much 39, okay, to the beginning of 42. And then we'll do the second half of the war later, because really we can look at World War II as two halves, okay? We can split this very easily into two halves, all right? The half where the Axis powers are winning and the half where the Allied powers start to turn around and win some things. So let's start World War II with Japan and imperialism. So remember, Germany wasn't the only one here, okay, that was part of the cause of World War II. Japan was also trying to gain an empire, and they had been for a while. We already talked about how they had invaded Korea. Remember, they annexed Korea. They ended up taking over Manchuria, okay, and some other islands like Formosa, which is now Taiwan, off the coast of China. So they were already trying to take over more land. And they continued into 1939 wanting to grow their empire. Now remember, they ally with the Germans, okay? And part of the whole allying with the Germans thing is they really can't see another route for this, all right? In order to grow their empire, they've figure that if they ally with the Allies, they're probably not going to get much out of this deal. But if they ally with Germany, they might get all of Asia. But the one problem here at first is they had been eyeing Siberia. They wanted to take over Siberia, okay, from the Soviet Union. They had been trying to move into that area for a while, and the Soviets had been concerned about this. But now, because they're allied with Germany, and because Germany and the Soviets signed that non-aggression pact of 1939, where they agree to not fight each other and split Poland, now Japan doesn't really have an option for invading Siberia. It would go against that non-aggression pact. So instead, Japan decides to look to the south. All right, they had already started occupying China. Now they're going to go full out occupying China. Okay. So they're going to start really trying to move troops into China and occupy China. They're going to find resistance there. China joins the Allied side, okay? But they're mostly successful at first. Not just in China, but elsewhere too. They look to start taking over parts of Southeast Asia and all the way down as far as Indonesia. They start taking over lots and lots of Pacific islands. All right, trying to control, okay, that Asian area. And really, there isn't a lot of pushback, okay, against Japan. There's just nobody over there that's a powerful ally. You have Australia to the south, but they're pretty far south, and Australia did not have a large standing army or navy, and so they weren't really a threat to Japan. And the colonial powers were all Europe and the United States, and they were far away. And the United States did not want to get involved, at least not militarily. Okay? However, all right, there are obstacles to Japan's imperialism even outside of the idea of Siberia. And the biggest obstacle is lack of resources. Okay? Japan is a relatively small archipelago in the Pacific, and they don't have as many mineral resources as they would like. This lack of resources is going to be problematic. In order to really get their military going, they need lots of stuff like steel and oil to keep it going, to build more ships, to keep their ships sailing, all that stuff. They need more. They need as much oil and steel as they can get. The problem is Japan was getting its steel and oil from the United States of America. Well, when Japan decides to invade China, the US decides to embargo Japan. They will not trade with Japan anymore. No oil, no steel, and this becomes problematic for Japan. Japan realizes that they're going to run out of reserves of oil very, very quickly here. And so, what are they going to do? They don't feel like they have a whole lot of options. And by 1941, although the US is not in the war, okay, they are on the Allied side. It's clear. And it might only be a matter of time before the US decides to join the war. So Japan has a problem here, okay? What do they do now? They can't get the resources they need. All right, they have this lack of resources, and even if they were able to invade China and start setting up production, it would take way too long. They need oil and steel now, and they don't have it. And the only people who do have it in large amounts are the U.S., who have decided not to trade with Japan, who have cut them off. So Japan doesn't know what to do, and so they start to make plans for the future, and we'll talk about those when we get there. Okay, so although they have early success in the Pacific theater, all right, taking over lots of islands, taking over lots of land, controlling lots of area, there are underlying problems with this. They don't know how long they can keep this up. But let's turn now to Europe, which is going to be way more important the first half of the war. Pretty much Japan's taking over in Asia, okay, and the fighting really hasn't started anywhere but Europe in late 1939 and 1940, okay? So really, this is where the fighting is going to start. It's eventually going to spread and become a true world war, okay? But at first, it's just like World War I in the fact that it is mostly fought in Europe. Early parts of World War II are going to see wild German success. All right, I know that some of this stuff's a little cut off, but you can see, okay, that yellow part, by the late 1939, right, that was all Axis controlled, okay? And at that point, Germany, remember, decides they are going to invade Poland, all right? They are going to invade Poland. And remember, they signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union to split Poland in half. Now, Poland was by no means a small place. It wasn't as well developed as Germany, but it was large and had an army, okay? It also had powerful allies in Great Britain and France. However, Germany has almost zero problems here, okay? Hitler decides he is going to use what he calls blitzkrieg, or lightning war. This involves fast-moving tank divisions with air support, and it is extremely effective. All right. Remember, we're still coming out of the Great Depression, and many of the European countries had tried to insulate themselves by spending less on their military. This is going to become problematic because Germany was doing almost the exact opposite at the end of the 1930s. They had decided to really build their military strongly because they wanted to take over land. So the Blitzkrieg is extremely successful. Poland falls in only 4 weeks, and then Germany turns its sights to other areas, including Hungary, the Netherlands, and Belgium and Denmark. Okay, they start to really take over land very, very quickly. And you can see, all right, by 1941, okay, by early 1941, Germany has taken over all of Europe. There is no part of Europe that is not at least mainland Europe, right, that is not either neutral or controlled by Germany. And really, when you see the neutral countries here, disregard Ireland for a minute. When you see the neutral countries here, the only one that was truly neutral, okay, was probably Sweden. Switzerland likes to claim they maintain neutrality, okay? And in terms of militarily, they did, all right? However, they were allowing Germany to move troops through, to station troops there, to move their money into Switzerland. Like, they were allowing the Nazi Party to pretty much do whatever they wanted. So, like, just because you stand by and don't fight the fact that you let the Axis powers do whatever they want meant you were kind of just going along with them, weren't you? Okay, it wasn't like they were truly neutral and not aiding any side. They did whatever Germany wanted them to do because Germany would have taken them over if they hadn't. So, although I understand their claim to neutrality, it's not really true. Okay, Spain and Portugal, on the other hand, were both sympathetic to Germany. So, although they don't actually participate in any fighting, they're sympathetic to Germany, and Turkey's no different. Okay, maybe Turkey, you could argue, was also neutral. All right, maybe the most neutral of the ones besides Sweden. Sweden surely was neutral, tried to not get involved at all. But that means that pretty much everywhere in Europe except for one place, is going to be controlled by the Axis powers by 1941. And that one place is Britain, Britain is an island, all right, figuratively and literally. One of those is a good thing. The literal one, the fact that they are an island, is going to insulate them from the German army. Remember, it was the German army supported by the Air Force in this Blitzkrieg campaign that was so successful. You can see they take over pretty much all of mainland Europe, all right? And Norway they take over, and Norway did not have a large army or navy or anything like that. They were relatively easy pickings. But you can also see that it would have been tougher to take over Great Britain, a huge power who is also protected by the fact that they're not connected by land to mainland Europe. So the German army can't just march right in against Great Britain. And Great Britain has the more powerful navy. Not by much, but it's powerful enough that the Germans can't really just take over Great Britain. But the figurative part is a problem. Great Britain is an island, and figuratively, they have no help, right? They have zero help at this point. By early 1941, Britain has no allies. Everybody else has been taken over by the end of 1940. You can see all the Allied powers are done. Remember, there's still the non-aggression pact in play between the Soviet Union and Germany. So at this point, the Soviet Union has split part of that. Like, you'll see those red arrows going into the Soviet Union. That's 1941. That's later. By the beginning of 1941, though, there is nothing there. That's controlled by the Soviet Union, and they are truly neutral. They are not on Great Britain's side, so Great Britain has no one on their side. And they turn to the United States for help. Now, the United States was insulated from all of this by an ocean, right? They really were also trying to stay mostly neutral. But they also realized that something very, very bad is going on here, They do not trust Germany. They don't trust Japan. And things are getting worse and worse. The president at the time, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, knows that this may be only a matter of time, and we need to do whatever we can, to help the Allies just in case this goes really, really badly, and all of a sudden we're on an island. So he gives assistance to Great Britain, not militarily, because the U.S. does not want that, The people of the United States, the citizens of the United States do not want that. But he signs lots of agreements, Lots of trade agreements with Great Britain, or pretty much like these ideas of, hey, we'll give you some stuff if you give us some stuff later. And by 1941, by the middle of 1941, the United States has pretty much given up all pretensions of neutrality. They are on the Allied side. They're just not fighting. They're just not fighting. All right. They pretty much signed an agreement called the Atlantic Charter with Great Britain, pretty much setting up the ideas of what will happen after the war. So they really want to end war for good after this. And they start to think about that. The problem is, right now, the Allies are losing the war badly. Now, this leads us to what happens in Britain, Remember, they're insulated from the German army, but that doesn't mean, that they are safe by any means. Germany wants to take them over and has plans to invade. The problem is, once again, Britain has a fairly powerful navy, and they're getting help from the United States in that regard. Okay, they get destroyers from the United States, 50 of them, so that they are able to better fight against the Germans. And the Germans don't really know how to do this, so they figure they have to completely demoralize the British and make the British think that they have no shot. They start with the Battle of Britain, okay? In the Battle of Britain in late 1940, the Germans pretty much bomb British bases and do a lot of damage to, all right, the British Air Force and to the British armies that are stationed there. Okay, lots of major hits. The British maybe do one of the best things possible and respond. Okay, they respond by bombing Berlin. Okay, they bomb Berlin. And by bombing Berlin, they are able to get inside the Germans' heads almost. All right, the Nazis' heads. And instead of continuing with what they were going to do, Germany shifts tactics and decides to bomb cities in Great Britain instead of bombing the bases, and instead of focusing on how can we best overwhelm Britain's military and their navy, they focus on totally trying to demoralize the people. And we get air raids on British cities. Okay? This is going to last, guys, for months and months. Okay? Where major cities of Great Britain are bombed almost at will. There is almost no defense by the British. Their Air Force was pretty well hit. They have almost no defense against this. They are hit by high-level bombers nonstop, night after night from Germany. Winston Churchill called this Great Britain's finest hour, and maybe it was. We talk a lot about what turns the tide of World War II. Okay, and there are a few things we need to talk about. We in the United States like to give lots and lots of credit to 1941, the end of 1941, and us joining the war. Okay, the war effort. We were already in the war effort, so it wasn't like we weren't. But us actually militarily joining the war effort as the turning point. But really, it starts before that. It starts with two other countries, Great Britain and the Soviet Union. Okay, they maybe are the ones who truly win the war, because if they don't hold out, all right, then it maybe never matters, because the U.S. doesn't have the help that it needs. Okay, and Germany has time to regroup and grow more powerful before having to deal with the United States. The reason he calls it the finest hour is because British people just do what they're told. I mean, that sounds bad, but they don't get upset. They don't abandon the war effort. They continue to do everything they can to continue to build back up their military while their cities take the brunt of the damage and death. Ordinary citizens take the brunt of the damage and death from the Germans so that the British can have time. All right? So that they give the world time, with Germany's focus on them, okay, to try to gain something back, right? To build up military. The U.S. is already, before 1941, is even ramping up the military effort, trying to get supplies to the Allied effort in Europe. Okay, and that's why he calls it Britain's finest hour, because it was everybody, right? It was the entire British citizenry that died, that did their part, okay, to try to give the Allies time. And it will turn out that time is really what the Allies needed. There are going to be some fatal mistakes. That was one of them, okay? Bombing the cities was probably a fatal mistake by Germany, because they decided to abandon their whole plan to some extent and focus on totally trying to kill Britain's will. Britain's will is never dies. They are committed to the war effort from day one and will continue until the end of the war. Well, now Germany has an issue. Okay, Hitler kind of abandons his whole plan. He realizes this isn't working. He abandons his whole plan to invade Britain at all, but needs more land. Okay, he doesn't want to have to worry about anybody. And besides the United States, who's all the way across the ocean, and Great Britain, who's also across water, okay, and powerful, there's only one more country that can really threaten Germany. And that's the Soviet Union. Now remember, they had signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union so that they wouldn't have to fight each other. Him and Hitler and Stalin signed this agreement, agree not to fight each other. Both of them get plenty of land, but Germany's not satisfied. Okay, Hitler is not satisfied with this because he realizes that that's a whole lot of land that he could be using if he has that area, and B, Soviet Union will always be a threat. Okay, communism does not sit well with what Germany's doing. All right, so he's afraid that eventually the Soviet Union will turn against him, and so before that can happen, he decides to violate the non-aggression pact and invade the USSR. Okay, so in the middle of 1941, he decides that now is the time has come to invade the USSR. And at first, it is a wild success once again. All right, Germany uses blitzkrieg tactics again and possibly kills as many as 2 million troops, or killed and captured as many as 2 million troops while moving well into Soviet territory. All right, and by September to October of 1941, the USSR holds vast territory in Russia, okay? Almost all the way to Moscow and all the way to Leningrad, which is modern-day St. Petersburg. And I wanted to talk about this real quick because this is one of the things that you don't hear about as much in World War II when you're just learning about it basically, but the siege of Leningrad was pretty terrible. The Germans reach all the way there by September 1941, and Leningrad, the actual city, is able to hold out from the German North Army. Okay, they are able to not fall because they're a very large city with lots of citizenry and lots of troops. They're able to hold Leningrad, but not do much else. They're surrounded by the Finns to the north, who had joined by this time the German side because they really didn't have any other choice. All right, and the Germans to the south, and all they can do is pretty much hold on. Guys, this is terrible. This is the largest atrocity in a city in history. All right. From that end of 1941, from September 1941 all the way until 1944, Leningrad is going to stay under siege. So almost 3 years. All right. It ends up being like 850 days or so. It's like 867, but whatever. Leningrad is under siege, and 1.5 million citizens will die. All right, from mostly starvation and disease. It's that bad. But Leningrad holds. And because Leningrad holds, they start to give hope to the rest of the Soviet Union. And part of the reason the Soviet Union doesn't fall that first year, 1941, they came very close to falling in 1941 and in 1942. But amazingly, one of the things that's going to help them the most is geography, weather, climate, okay? They are not ready for the bitter cold and the Russian winters that occur in Russia, okay? And they are not equipped well enough for this. They stretch their supply lines too thin in 1941, and they're going to do the same again in 1942. When the tide starts to turn, okay, and the Soviet Union maybe does as much to win this war as anybody else. But we'll talk about that when we talk about the tide of the war turning. For now, just know that at this point, end of 1941, Germany is completely successful. They've taken over pretty much all of Europe. The only holdout now is a little bit of Soviet Union, right? You can see even vast parts of the Soviet Union have been taken over, almost all the way to the capital city, and Great Britain. So, last thing we need to talk about today then, Pearl Harbor. Okay, because this is when, if we can mark the day when things really change, this might be it. So, December 7th, 1941, and FDR calls this a day that will live in infamy. And next week you'll read his speech, okay, his war speech, his declaration of war speech after Pearl Harbor. So what happens? Well, remember, Japan had this lack of resource problem, right? And so they decide that the best thing they can do is try to surprise the United States by attacking the United States. Okay? They decide to launch an attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and they choose Pearl Harbor, which is where the fleet is stationed. They decide to try and catch most of the ships in the harbor and destroy them. The U.S. didn't really think this was possible. First of all, Japan would have to sail all the way across, or halfway across the Pacific Ocean to get there, all right, without being detected. The U.S. thought that was ridiculous and it would never happen. Plus, Pearl Harbor is an extremely shallow harbor, okay? In other words, it's not good for torpedoes. The torpedoes at the time had to dive very, very deeply and then kind of come back up. Well, the U.S., based on its intelligence, figured that if they try to drop torpedoes, okay, the Japanese, that would not work at all because they would just hit the bottom of the harbor and be destroyed. So they weren't the U.S. was not particularly worried about Pearl Harbor being attacked. Okay, it's got high mountains around it. It's got a great lookout. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons that it would be hard to attack Pearl Harbor. But guess what? The Japanese figure it out. They were able to launch an extremely successful attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor, destroying many, many ships, okay, and seriously hurting the U.S.'s ability to go to war in the Pacific. Japan thought that this would give them leverage, okay, to sign a treaty with the United States. Japan figures, at least Japanese leadership, okay, a lot of Japanese leadership, figured that the U.S. would have to say, okay, look, we can't go to war now. We're at a disadvantage. We'll sign an agreement, a treaty saying we won't fight in the war and we'll give you some oil and steel. Obviously, that's not what happens, right? So what were the fatal miscalculations here by the Japanese? Because what they did worked, and yet it all goes so badly for them after that. All right. So I want to talk about the fatal miscalculations that the Japanese have, because the Japanese were probably correct to attack Pearl Harbor. They really didn't have any choice. If their goal was to build an empire and win World War II, okay, and the U.S. by the end of 1941 is firmly on the Allied side, even though we haven't actually declared war on anybody, we are firmly on the Allied side. Japan knows this. Japan doesn't have any choice here, okay? They are running out of time, and time is what they can't afford and what everyone else can afford. The Allies can afford time. The Japanese and the Axis powers cannot. So the attack on Pearl Harbor was actually probably a smart thing to do by the Japanese. But there's some fatal miscalculations here. Number one, they obviously did not understand the United States. Okay, they have a fatal miscalculation on how they think the United States, at least some Japanese, on how the United States will respond. They think the United States will be cowed by this attack because they've never really had an attack on their soil of this magnitude, and that they will revert back to neutrality. Instead, the opposite happens. Okay, U.S. citizenry immediately calls for war on Japan. Okay, as does the government, and we completely break out of our shell of isolationism that we had been in. All right? That period is over. Isolationism will end on December 7th, 1941 for the United States. Number two, second miscalculation. The Japanese thought this would give them superiority in the Pacific. Okay? And they thought that we would be unable to protect our carrier groups, and so our carrier groups would not be able to extend themselves into the Pacific. But they miscalculate the idea of the aircraft carrier, okay? Which gets its name from exactly that, the idea of aircraft. And it turns out that the U.S. and its ability to wage war with aircraft carriers is going to be extremely successful. All right. The US's use of aircraft carriers and submarines is going to completely dominate later on the Pacific area. Okay. So our air power from aircraft carriers turns out to be superior. Okay. Our bombers turn out to be slightly superior. And we're going to see that because they didn't know where the carriers were when they attacked Pearl Harbor. The carriers too big to go into Pearl Harbor, and they didn't know where they were, so they had no idea. They'd been scattered the days before, so they had no idea. Japan has no idea where they are. They can't attack them ahead of time, and so they leave these carrier groups available. Okay. And although this does harm the U.S.'s ability to really project its power in the Pacific, it doesn't kill its power to project in the Pacific because it still has those aircraft carriers. Maybe the last miscalculation by the Japanese was not being aggressive enough. We like to think of the Japanese as extremely aggressive by trying to attack a base that was halfway across the ocean and was part of a powerful nation, right? Who had maybe the most powerful navy in the world at this point. And Japan was sure, okay, that this would work, right? And we talk about what an aggressive plan this was. But maybe Japan's biggest miscalculation was they weren't aggressive enough. Okay? The United States was not ready for war. Japan was right about that. We weren't ready for war at all on December 7th, 1941. Okay? If Japan had come up with a different plan, where they had attacked Pearl Harbor like they did, but only as a precursor to invasion of the United States, things might have turned out much differently. Okay? We would not have been able, based on most experts, okay, to deal very well with an invasion of U.S. soil. Okay, the U.S., losing our Pacific Fleet, the U.S. West Coast was pretty much available for the taking. But Japan did not want to do this. They thought that it would be completely overextending themselves. And they may have been right, okay? The idea of trying to bring that many people and invade West Coast that is all the way across this massive ocean is pretty difficult. But it's possible. It could have been done, and we would not have been ready for it, all right? Instead, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor and just pulls back and waits, thinking that they've done enough damage where we will sign a treaty. But it doesn't happen. Okay. Instead, the U.S. goes to war. And here's where we get the famous quote, right, from the Japanese admiral who was in charge of the attack, who's one of the ones who said that there were other things that needed to be done here. He liked the idea of Pearl Harbor, but he also wanted to take it further. And he says that one of his, subordinates comes to him, at least this is how the story goes, right? And says that congratulates him on what a success Pearl Harbor was. And the Japanese admiral says, yes, but I fear all we've done is awoken a sleeping giant. And he's right, okay? The U.S. is a sleeping giant. And once we get going, we have people and resources that the rest of the world does not have. We have already been through, right, major industrial revolutions, and we are a economically powerful nation. And we start to ramp up the war effort. Okay, and once we start to ramp up the war effort, we have lots of people and lots of supplies that we are able to get all across the world. Okay, now I wanted to talk about also this idea of a total war real quick. We talked about World War I being a total war in terms of Europe and elsewhere even, and this is even more so, okay? But governments and citizens are going to approach war efforts in different ways. Remember, the U.S. calls on everyone, and so does England, right? So does Britain. Calls on everyone to help the war effort, right? Whether it be women, even children to some extent, right? Men, everyone has to do their part to win the war. Okay, everyone has to do their part to win the war. That's one of the big things. And you'll see all the advertisements in early World War II that are put out there about trying to help the war effort. Okay, women go to work, women work in factories. This is the change of the American lifestyle in that regard, all right, where women are going to enter the workforce in a way we have not seen before. And the same thing happens in Britain. But it does happen differently other places. Japan, actually prides itself on not involving its women. It says, look at all these other countries who involve their women, but we respect the family, and we are so confident that we can just do this with our men. Perhaps they shouldn't have been so confident, right? The Japanese tended to constantly paint the war effort in rosy optimism, right? Like everything's going to be fine because we're the best people on Earth and we have the greatest military on Earth. And they do this all the way up into the end of the war. All right. So their war effort was much different than, say, the US and Britain's war effort. And maybe that's because they were winning, right? So they were able to kind of project this, whereas we were obviously losing when we when we declare war, we're joining the losing side. And we say, wait, if we're going to win this, we need everyone. Germany does it differently. Germany does not use, as much of its citizenry, right? Instead, it leaves them kind of like cowering, in fear to some extent. Instead, they use forced labor. As much as 20% of the labor that was produced in Germany might have been from concentration camps. Now, that's good because economically it's fruitful, right? We're not paying these people, we're using them. However, it hurts them in the long run because these people are not getting paid, and therefore they're not getting treated very well either, if we recall. And production falls in Germany, whereas production in the US increases throughout the war. Production in Germany starts to fall after 1941. All right. So as one goes up, the other starts to come down. All right. Production starts to suffer. All right. There. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union is doing just anything it can to stay alive. All right. And we'll talk about that. They need time. All right. And they're doing pretty much anything they can to have time. The Soviet Union has not been an industrial power before this yet. And that's why they're sort of struggling right now. They're struggling in the war in 1941 because they don't have enough equipment for people. But what the Soviet Union has is lots and lots of people. All right. And they are committed, just like Britain. And finally, all right, colonial powers start to use colonial armies. And we're going to see this in North Africa, especially, where we're going to talk about what happens in North Africa in the war in early 1942. And how that starts to change the tide of the war. All right. But not just in Africa, everywhere, colonial armies are being used. Whether it's Southeast Asia, all right, whether it's in China. And the biggest colonial army is going to be the Indians. The British are able to mobilize the Indians, which is kind of shocking because remember, Gandhi is completely nonviolent. In fact, Gandhi tries to speak out against World War II. He doesn't want the Indians fighting in World War II. He doesn't want World War II to fight at all. Like, he doesn't even want to fight the Germans, which is in some ways kind of crazy, but that's just the way he was. And he was going to speak out against the war, but the British actually arrest him to stop him from speaking out against the war because they're afraid that the Indian people will listen to him, because they have been listening to him. And so they arrest him and put him under house arrest, where his wife dies, by the way. And they put them both under house arrest. And they are able to motivate the Indians to join the cause. All right. And the Indian army is huge and used to fight in Southeast Asia against the Japanese mostly. So we're seeing this total war, right? Worldwide war, people from every nation joining the cause. This really does turn into where World War I was a total war for the people involved in it. It really was still just a European war. Like, we can't stress that enough, right? It was really only fought in Europe. There was fighting some other places, but not a lot. And really, besides around the Mediterranean, it was really fought in Europe by European countries. This is not like that at all. World War II is truly a global war. All right, we'll talk about the second half of the war next week. Make sure you watched this today and that tomorrow you're able to do your discussion post. I will see you guys on Monday.